like confidence, is often a carefully constructed illusion of control. Not control in the ordinary sense, but psychological control, the ability to shape how others see her, respond to her, and ultimately validate her existence. As Carl Jung suggested in his exploration of the psyche, the persona we present to the world is often a mask, designed not to reveal who we are, but to protect us from what we fear we might be. In this dynamic, your role was never accidental. You were not just a partner, you were a mirror, a source of emotional feedback she could regulate, manipulate, and rely on. Your reactions, your attention, even your frustration, all of it fed into a system that allowed her to feel powerful, centered, in control. And over time, that control became indistinguishable from identity itself. So when you disappeared, it wasn't just your presence that vanished. The entire structure collapsed. Because control, for her, was never about you, was about stabilizing something unstable within herself. Without you reflecting back that validation, she is left with silence. And silence is dangerous. Silence doesn't lie. It doesn't reassure. It doesn't bend to illusion. It simply reveals. This is why your absence feels so disruptive to her. Not because she lost you as a person, but because she lost access to the version of herself she could only maintain through you. The composed exterior begins to crack. The certainty fades. And what replaces it is something far more unsettling: uncertainty about who she is without control. And here's the truth most people never realize. You didn't take her power away. You simply stopped participating in the illusion that gave it to her. And when someone's identity is built on illusion, the most powerful thing you can do is walk away and let reality speak. What follows your disappearance is something most people underestimate. They assume silence is passive, that it's a form of weakness or avoidance. But in this dynamic, silence becomes something far more profound. It becomes psychological pressure, not because you are doing anything to her, but because you have stopped doing everything she relied on. A narcissistic personality is organized around reaction. It feeds on engagement, whether positive or negative. Your words, your attempts to explain, even your frustration, these were all threads she could pull to maintain a sense of influence. In many ways, conflict itself was a form of connection. It reassured her that she still had access to your emotional world. And then suddenly, nothing. No explanations, no arguments, no attempts to fix what was broken, just absence. From a Jungian perspective, as Carl Jung explored, the human psyche is deeply unsettled by the unknown. We are driven to resolve ambiguity, to complete patterns, to find meaning in silence. But your silence offers none of that. It is not reactive, not emotional, not negotiable. It simply exists, and in doing so, it becomes something she cannot control, predict, or interpret. This is where the shift happens. Your silence stops being an absence of communication and becomes a presence she cannot escape. It forces her into a position she is not equipped to handle, one where she must confront uncertainty without tools of manipulation. There is no narrative she can easily rewrite, no immediate reaction she can provoke to restore balance. And so the mind begins to spiral. Questions emerge without answers. Doubts begin to surface. The very control she once exercised through interaction is now replaced by a void that refuses to respond. This is why silence feels so overwhelming to her. Not because it is loud, but because it is final in a way words never are. Words can be twisted. Silence cannot. And in that silence, something powerful happens. You reclaim your autonomy, and she is left confronting the one thing she cannot dominate: the unknown. What begins to unfold at this stage is often misunderstood. People imagine a dramatic breaking point, a visible collapse, something obvious and undeniable. But that's not how it works. The narcissistic ego is not fragile in a simple way. It is structured to resist direct confrontation. It doesn't shatter outwardly. It fractures inwardly. To understand this, you have to see the ego not as strength, but as a defense. A carefully assembled structure designed to hold together a much deeper instability. As Carl Jung observed, the psyche will go to great lengths to protect itself from truths it is not ready to face. And so, when your absence removes the external support that once stabilized her sense of self, the system doesn't collapse all at once. It begins to splinter. One part of her may still project confidence, maintaining the appearance that nothing has changed. Another part begins to feel the loss more acutely, registering the absence as rejection. And beneath that, something even deeper starts to stir: confusion. not just about you, but about herself. Because without the feedback loop you provided, there is no longer a clear reflection to rely on. This is where the internal conflict intensifies. She may oscillate between anger and longing, superiority and insecurity, certainty and doubt. These aren't calculated shifts, they are signs of fragmentation. The ego is trying to hold its shape, but the foundation beneath it is no longer stable. And without stability, contradictions begin to surface. What makes this particularly unsettling is that it's largely invisible to the outside world. From the outside, she may appear composed, even unaffected. But internally, the pressure builds. Because the one thing the narcissistic ego cannot tolerate is incoherence, the feeling that the self is no longer unified. And your absence creates exactly that. You remove the consistency she once used to organize her identity, and in doing so, you expose the fractures that were always there, just carefully concealed. And here's the reality that changes everything. You didn't break her ego, you revealed that it was never whole to begin with, and then something almost paradoxical begins to take shape. What once looked like indifference starts to transform into fixation. The same person who seemed emotionally distant, even dismissive, now becomes preoccupied, sometimes intensely so. But this shift is often misinterpreted. It's easy to mistake it for love, for regret, for a sudden awakening. In reality, it is something far more complex and far less romantic. Because what she is drawn to is not you as a personette, is the disruption you represent. When you were present, you were predictable, available, within reach. Even your resistance could be managed, because it still operated within a framework she understood. But your absence removes that framework entirely. It introduces something the psyche finds deeply unsettling, an unresolved pattern. And as Carl Jung observed, the human mind is compelled to complete what feels incomplete, to resolve what remains open. You become that open loop. Your silence, your withdrawal, your refusal to engage it creates a psychological tension that seeks release. And so, the mind turns back toward you, not out of connection, but out of compulsion. She may revisit old conversations, reinterpret moments, search for hidden meanings that were never there. She may watch from a distance, attempt indirect contact, or create situations designed to pull you back into interaction. But this isn't about reconciliation. It's about restoration of control. Obsession, in this context, is not a sign of depth, it is a response to disruption. You have stepped outside the role she assigned you, and in doing so, you have become unpredictable, and unpredictability, to a control-oriented psyche, is intolerable. So the focus intensifies, not because she suddenly values you more, but because she can no longer define you, and what cannot be defined must be pursued, analyzed, and, if possible, reclaimed. This is the moment where many people make a critical mistake. They interpret this attention as validation, as proof of their worth. But in doing so, they step back into the very dynamic they worked to escape, because the truth is simple and not always comfortable. When someone becomes obsessed after losing control, they are not seeking connection, they are seeking restoration. And if you understand that, you will see clearly that the power is not in being wanted again, but in choosing not to return. At this stage, something subtle but deeply significant begins to happen. Faced with the instability created by your absence, the mind moves quickly to restore order, but not necessarily truth, because truth in this context is too threatening. It would require acknowledging dependence, loss of control, and a fragile sense of self. So instead, the psyche does what it has always done when confronted with discomfort. It rewrites the story. This is not a conscious act of deception. It is a psychological defense. As Carl Jung often emphasized, the ego protects itself not by confronting reality, but by reshaping it into something more tolerable. And so, the narrative begins to shift. The complexities of the relationship are simplified. Your withdrawal is no longer seen as a response to dysfunction, it becomes betrayal. Your silence is no longer an act of self-preservation, it is framed as cruelty or abandonment. In this rewritten version, she becomes the one who was wronged. You become the one who caused the pain. And this serves a very specific purpose. It allows her to maintain a sense of internal consistency. Because if she were to see the situation clearly, she would have to confront something far more unsettling, that her sense of control was never as stable as she believed. and that your departure exposed something she could not regulate. So instead of facing that, the mind constructs a version of events where she remains intact, justified, even righteous. But here's where it becomes more complex. This narrative isn't always stable. It requires constant reinforcement. It may be shared with others, repeated internally, even exaggerated over time. Because beneath it, the original fracture still exists. The doubt hasn't disappeared, it has only been covered. And occasionally, in moments of quiet, that doubt resurfaces. That's the tension of a rewritten reality. It protects, but it also isolates. Because the further one moves from truth, the harder it becomes to genuinely resolve what was lost. And this is where your clarity becomes essential. If you allow yourself to be pulled into that narrative, if you try to correct it, argue with it, or defend yourself within it, you unknowingly validate the distortion. Because you are now playing a role in a story that was never meant to be accurate, only comforting. The deeper truth is this: not every version of you that exists in someone else's mind is yours to correct, and real power begins the moment you stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. And eventually, we arrive at the point where everything converges not outwardly, but internally. Because when all the strategies fail, when control cannot be re-established, when narratives begin to lose their stability, something unavoidable emerges. There is no one left to manage, no one left to influence, no one left to mirror back a curated sense of self. What remains is a confrontation that was postponed for a very long time, a confrontation with oneself. This is the moment most people never witness, because it happens in silence. Not the silence you created, but the silence that follows when distraction is no longer available. As Carl Jung suggested, the psyche cannot indefinitely avoid what lies in the unconscious. Sooner or later, what has been suppressed begins to surface not as clarity, but as discomfort, restlessness, even a vague sense of emptiness that cannot easily be explained. Without you, there is no external structure to organize her identity around, no reactions to regulate, no emotional exchanges to anchor her sense of relevance. And in that absence, something unfamiliar begins to take shape, a question that cannot be easily dismissed. Asterisk, who am I without control? Asterisk, this is not a question the narcissistic mind is prepared to answer, because answering it would require stepping beyond the persona, beyond the carefully maintained image, and into a space where there is no guarantee of certainty or superiority. It is a space of raw self-awareness, and for many, it feels less like discovery and more like exposure. Some will attempt to escape it by seeking new sources of validation, new dynamics, new distractions. Others may linger in it briefly, sensing that something deeper is being revealed, but not yet having the tools to fully confront it. And a few, though rare, may begin the difficult process of genuine self-examination. But regardless of the path taken, one truth remains constant. Your absence removed the illusion of external control and forced an encounter with internal reality. And that is something your presence could never have done. Because real change does not begin when someone is managed, it begins when they are left with nothing to manage but themselves. So understand this clearly. Walking away was not just an act of separation, it was an act of truth. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in another person's life is to leave them alone with who they really are.